I have a GoPro camera. And a GoPro camera is a very small camera that comes with a housing when you buy it that you can put it underwater. And the camera is pretty powerful. It gets great video. And GoPro has been incredibly successful with this camera, not just because the camera is powerful and compact, but because every camera they sell comes with that housing that you can put it just about anywhere. With the housing come all types of adapters and connections so that you can stick it in places that you normally wouldn't be able to stick it. Recently, though, I noticed that some of my footage was looking kind of fuzzy and hazy. And I thought, man, my camera is going bad. I've had it for a couple of years. I guess it's just wearing out. But then I looked closer and I realized that the camera wasn't the problem. It was the housing. It was that container, the container that it went in so that it could be waterproof. And that lens that on the outside of the housing had gotten scratched, probably crawling through the mud at a Tough Mudder or something like that. But because of that outside case had been scratched, this housing that was meant to make the camera able to go in places that it normally couldn't go, it was obscuring the view and ruining the footage. It was making it impossible for the camera to do its job. I got a new housing, put the camera in it. Now it works fine. It was just that outside piece. When Paul writes this letter to Titus, he's writing to a young man who has served with him, who is now on the island of Crete. This island has 100 cities, and Paul wants him to establish churches all over the place. In Titus 1:5, he says, I've left you there to set up elders in every city. He wants every city to have a church where there's leadership proclaiming the gospel so that everyone on that island could know the truth. And Paul knows that they need it because Paul quotes one of the people from Crete, one of their writers. He calls him a prophet because what he says is true. Verse 12, he says, their own have said that all Cretans are evil, liars, slow bellies. In other words, they're all gluttons. He said, it's true, they need this gospel message. But in the verses right after that, Paul points out that while there are some people there proclaiming the message right now, they're proclaiming truth, but it isn't truth, it's falsehood. And they're living their lives in a way that isn't convincing. He says in verse 16, they profess that they know God, but in works they deny Him, being abominable and disobedient, and unto every good work reprobate. What Paul says to Titus is, you've got to go and put churches all through this island, but I want you to be careful that you and the people who are believers there in Crete, the people who are to carry the gospel into this island, that you don't obscure the message of the gospel. He didn't want the people who were to carry this powerful message of the gospel to get in the way of the gospel. Paul wanted everyone there to see the message of Christ. He wanted everyone there to see this love and kindness appear. At the end of chapter 2, he mentions the grace of God appearing. Chapter 3, which we looked at last week, he mentioned when the love and kindness of God appeared unto me. He was saying everyone needs to see the gospel of grace, just like I saw it. So Titus, you have to be careful that you don't get in the way of someone's view of the gospel. Have you ever been maybe at a sporting event and someone in the front won't sit down? You know, they've obstructed your view. My father worked for Delta Airlines, and we lived in Nashville when Delta went through a major reorganization. My father ended up being transferred to Norfolk, Virginia. That's how I ended up living in Virginia Beach, Virginia. But during that time, he was interviewing at different airports, trying to find the place that he was going to work. And one of the airports that he went to was in Dallas. So while they were there, they went to a baseball game. They went and saw the Rangers play. They went to the stadium hoping to buy some tickets and get right in. They said, I'm sorry, we're just about sold out. The only tickets we have left is a partially obstructed view. He said partially obstructed view was an understatement. They were sitting directly behind a major column that supported the stadium. They could see the batter over on this end, and they could see the center fielder over on this end. That's all that they could see. Later in the game, some people left, so they were able to move out from behind that pillar. They could see the game. But then this lady kept standing up in front of them. My dad's friend who was there with him said, "Miss, will you sit down so we can see the game?" And she said, "Well, at least you can still see more than when you were sitting behind that pillar." And he said, "Not by much." Paul wanted to make sure that all of the people in Crete would have a good view of the gospel. That Titus, in the way that he lived and the way that the people in the church in Crete lived, that it wouldn't be a hindrance to the message of the gospel. For that reason, he tells them in chapter 2, verse 5, live in a way so that the gospel is not blasphemed. In chapter 2, verse 12, he says, so that the sound speech will not be condemned. He wanted to make sure that everyone could see the gospel clearly, that it would appear to all men. When Paul wrote to Titus, he wrote to him about the condition of the island he was on. And he said, these people need to know the grace of God. Titus, don't get in the way of that. Friends, if Paul was writing to us today, he could easily talk about the condition of our city, the condition of our region, the condition of our world. And he could say the same words to us. Make sure that you don't obstruct the view of the gospel. Make sure that you make it clear to everyone the grace of God. Paul didn't want them to not only stay out of the way of the gospel, he also wanted them to lift it up. Look at chapter 2 and verse 10. There in verse 10, he's talking to those that have bosses, people that they work for. He says, not purloining or pilfering, not taking from your bosses, but showing all good fidelity. Be faithful at your job, that they may adorn the doctrine of God. What's it mean to adorn the doctrine of God? The word adorn, it means to prepare or set something in order in a way that brings the ultimate honor. When Paul wrote to Titus, he said, Titus, I want you to adorn the message of grace. I want you to adorn the gospel so it's set out in a way that everyone can appreciate. Ladies, this would be preparing a meal and setting out the fine china. Guys, this would be grilling a steak and getting the best cut of meat. We're going to do our very best with what we have here. This same word is used in Revelation in the New Testament when John says, I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. She is completely prepared. She is presented in the most honoring way possible. You've been at a wedding. That bride makes her entrance at the back door. Everyone stands and faces her, and the music starts. Everyone's supposed to be looking at her, right? She's been adorned and prepared for this moment. Paul says, Titus, I want you guys to not only stay out of the gospel's way, I want you to lift it up. I want you to present it in a way that everyone can see it, and everyone can appreciate it, and everyone can see just how beautiful it is. And friends, if we're going to do that, we need to follow the commands that Paul gives Titus here, because we've been called to adorn the gospel. Not only stay out of its way, but to present it in a way that's honorable, that everyone can see and everyone can appreciate. And here in this passage, I see three ways that you and I can beautifully adorn the gospel. First of all, we can adorn the gospel by living the gospel. We can adorn the gospel by living the gospel. In other words, we can adorn the gospel by walking the walk. Chapters 2 and 3 talk about the results of a transformed life. If we know Christ, this is how we'll be different. In 1:16, he says there are people who say they know God, but the way that they live, it makes it clear that they don't know God. Their speech says one thing, but their actions say another. Paul repeatedly points to transformation as something that brings it into clear view. So what are these transformations? Well, there's several here. Chapter 2, verse 2 says, older men be sober, serious, temperate, firm in the faith, loving and faithful. Verses 3 and 4, older women likewise be holy, not gossips, not silly and drunk, teachers of good things to younger women, teaching those younger women to be serious, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be pure and honest and solid managers of their households. To the younger men, show self-control. In all things, show a pattern of good works. In your teaching, show diligence and integrity. Exhort those bondservants to be obedient and to please their master in all things. Renounce ungodliness in verse 12 and worldly lust. Live self-controlled, upright, and godly in this present culture. Then he continues on into chapter 3 and verse 1. He says, submit to rulers and authorities and be obedient. Be ready for every good work. Verse 2, speak evil of no one. Avoid quarrels. Be gentle and kind. Paul lists a lot of things here that are a result of the transformation that we experience in Christ. And we're not going to cover them all, but I want to point out two themes that I see. I want you to notice that Paul seems to prioritize the way that we act and the affections that we have. Paul was concerned with how the Christians of Crete adorned the gospel in their actions and in what they cared about. Because he knew what they cared about or what their mindset was would result in right actions. And the several commands that Paul makes sure to mention here, self-control and sobriety are consistent themes. In verse 2, he says, be temperate. In verse 3, he says, do what becomes holiness. Verse 4, he says, deny ungodliness and worldly lust. If we are believers in Christ, there should be something different about us. That should make a difference in us. We should live our lives differently. The world has every right to expect more out of us if we have experienced the grace of Christ. Just this week, 32 million names released in a hack of a website that advertises itself as the premier place for married men and women to find someone to have an affair with. It's in the few days since that has been released, a few high-profile Christian celebrities have been found to have been among those that had an account on that website. Talk about obscuring the gospel message. When that person's name is brought up, no one's going to think about the message that they shared. They're going to think about the lifestyle that they were living behind what they thought were closed doors. Friend, I believe that very few things have obscured the gospel more than the sexual sins of those that claim to be followers of Christ. Let's let that hit home. Very few things have obscured the message of the gospel more than those that claim to be followers of Christ living in sexual sin. Think about all of the scandals that have rocked the church over the last several decades. Think about the many people that what they know of church is what they've seen on the news about this pastor who stole money and had an affair with someone in the church. This person who was using the offerings to carry on their affair. This person that used mission giving. And those sexual sins, every one of them, every time that we fail to exhibit self-control, it puts a black eye upon the church. And when the doors are opened and people look back to see the gospel, what they see is that black eye. They don't see a bride adorned and ready for the wedding day. We can be sure to be unobscuring to the gospel and adorn it when we live with self-control. Self-control and sobriety. The word sober is used 4 times in this chapter, but there are also several references to diligence, being serious-minded, having gravity and sincerity. This call to sobriety is not just an absence of being drunk, but it's rather a call to right-mindedness or serious-mindedness, sincerity. You see, you can be alcohol or substance-free and still be drunk with power, still be drunk with rage, still be in denial about your lifestyle of sin. Paul repeatedly says in the New Testament to take every thought captive, to be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Why? Because he knows that if our minds are transformed, it'll affect the way that we act. He wants them to be sober or right-minded so that their actions will follow. Christianity is not a mindless religion. We are called to come and think about Scripture, to think about the gospel and the impact that it makes on our lives. We should be right-minded, and we should also be level-headed. We shouldn't be the rabble-rousers. We shouldn't be the rioters and the ragers. Christians should be the people in the community, in the culture, that are the cool, calm, and collected ones. We should be the ones who think about things appropriately, that we respond with a measured voice. Overall, what Paul is begging Titus and the Christians in Crete is that they would walk in a way that matches their talk. And every one of us has experienced someone who can talk the talk but does not walk the walk. And it's a turnoff. Now, it may be that you're here and you say, Pastor Daniel, I can appreciate what you're saying, and I know that we need to live differently as Christians, but I've tried and I can't. Or I've thought about becoming a Christian, and I know that I just can't live that lifestyle. I'm going to mess up. So it's better off for me just to hang back. I want you to look at verse 14 of chapter 2. Look at that in your Bible. Paul has just finished giving all of these commands, and he says, he's speaking of Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us that he might what? Redeem us from all iniquity. Iniquity is breaking all those commands he just mentioned. And purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. What's it mean, a peculiar people? A people who live differently. A people who live by these commands. How is it that this happens? Christ does it in us. This morning, don't hear, hey, listen, you need to get your act together and start living differently. No, you need to hear, allow Christ to come into your life and make a transformation. If you're struggling to walk the walk, let me encourage you to hold on to the Father's hand tightly. Every one of these little children around here, they learned to walk the same. They started off by crawling, and then they started pulling themselves up. And then they started holding on to the hand of mom or dad or grandma and grandpa as they stumbled around the house. That's what the Lord wants to do for us. He wants to take our hands and show us how we can walk this walk. If you find yourself unable to walk the walk, welcome to the club. It's only through the grace and power of the Lord that we are able to walk the walk. We adorn the gospel by living the gospel, and we adorn the gospel by preaching the gospel. We need to walk the walk, but we also need to talk the talk. Chapter 2, verse 1, he says, speak the things which become sound doctrine. Verse 8, he speaks of sound speech that cannot be condemned. Verse 15, he says, these things speak and exhort and rebuke with all authority. Verse 9, he says, avoid foolish questions and genealogies. In chapter 3, he says, avoid these things that are trivial. You know what the temptation is? Here's the temptation. And when I say this, you're going to be like, what? People are tempted to auto-tune the gospel. Now, auto-tune was a recording producer's tool that he could use in some software to fix the bad spots in a singer's song. Used to, back in the day, they would have some singer sing the song 15 times. And every time they sang, there would be, this part was just perfect, but on this chorus, they kind of messed up a little bit. But over here on this verse, it was great. And they would take and they would splice all of that together. Splice all that tape together to have one seamless song that was all of the best parts. But with software, they were able to go in and just fix individual notes. Through auto-tune, they could take that note that was a little flat and move it up. Take that note that was a little sharp and move it down. But then somebody started using auto-tune to the nth degree. And now you can't even recognize the person's voice that's singing. It's digitized. It's not their actual voice. It's a computer. It's a computer's representation. And what many churches are tempted to do today is to dress the gospel up to the point where it doesn't even look like the gospel anymore. Let's take the message and make it where everyone will like it and everyone will be pleased with it and nobody will have anything bad to say about it. And what we've done is we've auto-tuned the gospel. We've made it counterfeit. It's not even the gospel anymore. We've photoshopped the gospel, if you will. We've made it look like something that it isn't. Friend, let me tell you, you and I, we're called to present the gospel, to set the table for it. But you and I, we cannot change the gospel. To change the gospel is to corrupt the gospel. It must be that true, authentic message of Jesus Christ dying on a cross, a bloody death to pay for the sins that you and I have committed so that we can be forgiven, so that we can experience new birth and new life. That's got to be the message that we preach. And it may not be popular in a lot of places, and it may be controversial, and it may seem trivial to some, but that's the message that we must preach. And there's not only a temptation to compromise the gospel, there's also this temptation to add to the gospel. Paul said, don't get wrapped up in these foolish questions and these foolish arguments. Don't add a bunch of rules to the gospel, he said. You see, when we preach the message of the gospel, we can face the temptation to make it easier for everyone to become a part of it. Or we can also face the temptation to add our own opinions to it. Friend, just as people don't need a gospel that isn't true and isn't real, they don't need a gospel with my thoughts and my opinions added to it. They don't need the gospel with a bunch of rules and commands that I think are appropriate. They don't need the opinions and the commands of men. They don't need trivia and controversy. They need the gospel. Earlier I said few things have obscured the gospel more than the sexual sins of those that claim to be believers. One of those few things are the controversies over trivial matters that come up among believers. Because there are many people that have been turned off to the gospel. They don't see the gospel because all they see is our fighting and bickering. And that's the reason in chapter 3 Paul said, don't bother with that. You focus on preaching the message of the gospel. So we adorn the gospel when we preach the gospel, when we live the gospel, when we talk the talk and we walk the walk. But we also adorn the gospel when we welcome all to the gospel. You see, it doesn't matter that we walk the walk and talk the talk if we're just walking and talking by ourselves, right? We need some people to walk and talk with. Look at your Bible at chapter 3 and verse 2. There in these commands, Paul is telling them not to be cruel and speak evil of people. He says at the end of chapter 2, he says, speak evil of no man, be no brawler, but gentle, showing all meekness to all men. New American Standard translates that this way, show all consideration to all men. English Standard Version says, show perfect courtesy towards all people. And that comes right before what Paul said, we looked at last week. The love and kindness appeared to me. I was one of those people before the love and kindness appeared to me. You and I, we were one of those people before the love and kindness appeared to me. Paul is saying to Titus is show people hospitality and welcome them in. Because we were the same way before we saw the love and kindness of God. And you may be the love and kindness of God that someone first sees. Welcome them in. I believe this command is so very much a part of welcoming people. It's so much a part of not just obstructing the gospel to bring them into the church where they can see the gospel, but adorning the gospel. Welcoming people to our church doesn't just give them the opportunity to hear the message of grace, it also presents the message of grace. Hear this. There are people that you can be a gospel witness to by encouraging them, welcoming before they even make it into the sanctuary. There are people that because of your love and kindness that you show to them as they arrive here, they're going to hear my message more clearly because you've showed them kindness. I read really two very interesting articles recently. First one was some researchers took a long-standing experiment and they kind of turned it on its head. It was an old experiment where they took a rat and they put him in a cage with 2 bottles of water. One bottle of water was absolutely normal, just water. The other one was water laced with cocaine. 9 out of 10 of the rats would eventually completely forget about the regular water and only drink the cocaine water. They would go to it so often that they would eventually kill themselves. But these scientists, these researchers, they decided to do the experiment a little differently. Instead of placing one rat in a cage by himself, they placed several rats in a cage. And what they found is that when the rats were in a cage together, they weren't by themselves. They didn't become so dependent on the water laced with cocaine. They used less than 1/4 of the cocaine that a single rat would. And while 9 out of 10 of those rats that were caged by themselves would become dependent and eventually die, none of the rats that were in that communal cage died. And none of them became heavy users because they were surrounded by other rats. Community is essential. It's a fundamental need of our hearts. And I believe that God made us that way so that we could have friendships for the sake of the gospel. Another article that I read was in this most recent issue of Reader's Digest. This woman moved into the suburbs because she was hoping to start a family. She quit her job because she was in a new neighborhood. She had a new job. She didn't have any of her old friends. She was desperate to make friends So she started volunteering at the local nonprofit. She joined a local church, even started singing in the choir. She had backyard barbecues. But a couple of years later, when her child had been born and she took him to register him for kindergarten, she realized that she didn't have one person who lived locally that she could write down on the form to pick him up in case she was held up with an emergency. She had made some friends in the neighborhood. She had some people that she had invited over for barbecues, but she didn't have any close friends. All of her relationships were superficial. What she writes about is that she was desperate for some meaningful relationships and friends. I believe that in this community, in our community, there are people who are lonely. And we should show them all hospitality and welcome them in for the sake of the gospel. And when we do, it'll adorn the gospel. Some of you may have noticed on our door out here as you walked in, we've got a permit. And we're working towards enclosing that area that's an awning so that when people arrive, there'll be a place to mingle. And when people exit, there'll be a place to mingle after our services. When we had a problem, when one of the most friendly people in our church referred to someone who'd been attending regularly for 3 months as a first-time visitor, they'd never made contact with this person. And I mean, you don't need to look around and do a head count, but we're not a mega church. You know, I believe that we are an incredibly friendly church. And I am biased, but I think that I can say that objectively, having visited other churches, I think this is an incredibly friendly church, but our structure just doesn't lend itself, and we're trying to change that because we value community and friendships. Not just as something that'll be nice, but as a way that we can adorn the gospel and present this message of grace. That we can take this gospel into our community. And some of this is hard, and some of it requires sacrifice. All those commands that Paul wrote to Titus about, they're difficult. This call to preach the message clearly and in a balanced way, it's not easy. This idea of reaching out and building friendships and building community, it's not easy. But to carry the gospel to others, I've got to put the gospel first. Because if I put myself before the gospel, what I have done is come in between you and the gospel. I've got to put the gospel first to carry it to you. Are you familiar with an eclipse? I'm not talking about the car, I'm talking about the event. An eclipse is pretty neat. An eclipse is when the moon comes between us and the sun, and what we are in is in the shadow of the moon. Now, normally, the moon just reflects. I'm shining right in Daryl's eyes there. Normally, the moon reflects the light of the sun into our night. Friend, that's what we're called to do. We're called to reflect the gospel of God's grace, the light and glory of Jesus Christ. We're called to reflect it into the dark places in this community. That's what we're called to do, to get the light into a place that it isn't. Sorry, Day Day. But what happens is that we end up coming between the light. We eclipse it. Now, thankfully, God's grace and truth, His glory and light is far too great for any one person to eclipse. Just like the moon, it can't block out the entire sun. It can just cast a shadow. But friend, I don't want to eclipse the grace and truth of God. I don't want to get in its way. I want to reflect it into a place where it's not currently at. That's what we're called to do. And the way that we live, and the way that we preach and proclaim and teach, and the way that we welcome this community into contact with the gospel. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.